нас Великая Отечественная война советского народа против немецко-фашистских захватчиков. Наше дело правое, враг будет разбит, победа будет за нами.
Attention! Moscow calling. Citizens of the Soviet Union. Today, at 0400 hours, without any declaration of war, German armed forces attacked the borders of the USSR. A great patriotic war of the Soviet people against fascist aggressors has begun. Ours is the righteous cause. The enemy shall be defeated. Victory will be ours. Thus, the Nazi invasion was announced by Yuri Levitan in Radio Moscow, the early morning of the 22nd of June of the year of 1941. Shortly thereafter, in the fall of the same year, Radio Moscow and Yuri himself were evacuated to Sverdlovsk and later to the city of Kuibysheb in order to avoid German bombings for the remainder of the war. His voice became the spirit of the Soviet resistance, and he always commenced his bulletins with the words in Russian, "Vнимание, говорит Москва," which mean, "Attention, Moscow calling." The Eastern Front is likely the least appreciated and least understood component of the Second World War. Despite the significant impact Allied efforts had on the Western Front, their efforts were ultimately of secondary importance compared to the costly and more grueling efforts of the Soviet Union in defeating Germany. The war on the Eastern Front was the bloodiest theater of war of the bloodiest war in history. It was a cataclysmic struggle between two evil regimes. But politics is not everything, and people are the real protagonists. Some were indeed evil and criminal, but most people were just caught in the middle. This is a daily account of war in the Eastern Front. Now, personally, I do not condone hate speech or any evil regime or political stance, especially not the Nazi one, but I am no communist either. This account strives to be as rigorous as the sources I can find and as detailed as my personal time and resources allow. In sum, this is a one-man endeavor. I do hope that you find it to be informative, above all entertaining and respectful. History has many lessons to give, and reality always seems to surpass fiction. Conflict between these two nations was inevitable the moment that Hitler rose to power. He did like to portray himself as the only defense against international communism, and both regimes competed for the same area of expansion and influence. Let us also remember that they already fought each other, by proxy that is, in the Spanish Civil War, where both derived practical lessons. Now, in this episode, we will talk about the state of both nations at the start of the war, their political situation, the military doctrine, and the preparation and readiness of their armed forces. First, the politics. In the late 1930s, the Soviet Union was in a very weakened state, which was derived from the purges, previous conflicts, and collectivist economic mismanagement. Stalin acknowledged that conflict was indeed inevitable, but he was in no position to take on any offensive strategy, and therefore he needed allies to at least contain Hitler, or maybe buy time. On the other hand, he was happy enough to have a national socialist dictatorship that threatened and checked the capitalist West, who was its ideological enemy. The 1938 Munich crisis convinced him that neither France nor Great Britain were reliable allies, as they folded before Hitler's demands and threats of aggression. Stalin was convinced that if he allied himself with France and Great Britain, they would gladly sacrifice the Soviet Union just as happily as they had done with Czechoslovakia. Stalin was not invited to talks on Czechoslovakia, nor was he consulted or even included in Britain and France's guarantee on Poland, considered an enemy by Stalin, and where the Soviets also had territorial claims. Poland and Romania's distrust of the Soviets floundered any potential alliance with the West. In light of the situation, Stalin decided that a compromise with the Nazis would buy him enough time to ready the Soviet Union for the unavoidable conflict with the Axis. And therefore, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, together with a secret clause that set zones of influence and annexation for both dictatorial regimes. Hitler was also adamant to sign this pact, even if it was with its nemesis and most hated enemy, since it would allow him to avoid war on two fronts and make a swift victory possible for the Axis. The rapid German victories and conquests were very unexpected in Moscow, where Stalin hoped for Poland to resist for months on end and war with the Western Allies to drag on for years, weakening both Germany and the Soviet Union's capitalist enemies. When this failed to materialize, and all but the United Kingdom fell before Hitler, Stalin rushed the occupation of the territories awarded to him by the secret clause of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, namely Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. He also demanded land and basing rights in Finland, and when the little country refused, the Soviets attacked her. All these moves were agreed upon by the Germans in the pact, but in any case, they were greatly irritated that Stalin would claim his share of the spoils. And when tiny Finland gave the Soviets a bloody nose and a great humiliation in the Winter War, the Germans were convinced that the Soviet military was a giant with feet made of mud. Let us recall now Hitler's famous quote when referring to the Soviet Union. Quote, "All you have to do is kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will crumble to the ground." Unquote. Finally, on economic grounds, the Nazis' deal with the Soviets was to provide advanced technology, for example, naval technology, in exchange for raw materials and resources that Germany was in serious need of. The Nazis firmly believed that they could extract more resources and profit from directly exploiting occupied lands than through free commerce. They were not comfortable sharing technology with the communist enemies. And in any case, nobody knew how long the Soviets would abide by this pact either. Military Doctrine. Soviet military doctrine was extremely advanced in the 1930s. And in David Glanz's words, it owed its brilliance to the Civil War commander Mikhail Tukhachevsky and the military theorist Vladimir Triandafilov, who developed a strategy theory of successive operations based on the Soviet military failure against Poland in 1920 and also the failed German offensives in France during 1918. Put simply, they believed that modern armies were too large and resilient to be defeated in one cataclysmic battle. Instead, the attacker would have to fight a series of offensive battles, each followed by a rapid exploitation into the enemy's rear, and then another battle when the defender reorganized his forces. This new doctrine required the planning of independent operations within the strategic theater or campaign. In Russian, it was called the operational art, оперативное искусство. During the 1930s, the Soviets developed the tactical concept of deep battle, or глубокий бой in Russian, using tanks and planes. This naturally led to the deep operation, or глубокая операция, in order to achieve the desired breakthrough before the enemy could react and seal the gaps in the front line. Of course, the Soviet Union was not the only one discussing or even developing these doctrines. But the main difference with other countries, such as Germany, was that Stalin sanctioned this doctrine and devoted the resources of the Soviet Union, poor as it was at this time, to providing the resources necessary for developing the doctrine. I am quoting again David Glantz. The Soviets formed their first two mechanized corps in the fall of 1932, 3 years before Germany created its first Panzer divisions. Over the next several years, the number and complexity of armored, mechanized, and airborne formations grew steadily. The airborne forces were elite units, composed largely of dedicated communists who had learned to parachute in the Komsomol, the Leninist youth organization. In the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union led the world in the production, planning, and fielding of mechanized forces. It was well ahead of its German counterparts in both theoretical concepts and practical experience of armored warfare. In Germany, Heinz Guderian and other armed theorists received only limited and marginal support from civilian and military leaders. This great advantage, however, was completely undone by the Great Purge. The Great Purge was a reprisal of most of the military officer corps. A large-scale, piecemeal series of arrests, summary assassinations, and deportations to labor camps in the Gulag by Stalin, who had started with civil society already back in 1934. Stalin discharged 47,000 officers, convicted 3,000 of these of alleged crimes. In 1937, the brilliant and loyal Mikhail Tukhachevsky was arrested and shot in the back of the head. He signed his confession, which was a paper stained with his own blood, in disbelief after extensive torture proceedings, and even many of the judges in his mock trial suffered the same fate. Some of them having said after the trial, "I am next," for they could not believe the criminal purge of loyal communists that Stalin was undertaking. For the next 4 years, right up to the German invasion, Soviet officers disappeared with alarming frequency, with many officers executed and others sent to the labor camps in Siberia. In addition to the heads of 9 staff directorates in Moscow, the victims included the commanders of all 16 military districts, 90% of the deputy commanders, chiefs of staff and staff section heads of such districts, 80% of corps and division commanders, and 91% of regimental commanders, deputies and chiefs of staff. The final toll included 2 successive heads of the Red Air Force, 15 admirals and 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union. In all, 14 of the 16 field army commanders, 136 of 199 division commanders, and 50% of all regimental commanders were also disgraced and imprisoned or executed. Out of an estimated total of 75,000 to 80,000 military officers, at least 34,000 and perhaps as many as 54,700 endured dismissal during the purges. Political commissars and security officers of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, the infamous NKVD, also suffered heavily. The purges were still ongoing when war engulfed the Soviet Union in 1941, with some of the purged, such as the future Marshal of the Soviet Union, Kirill Meretskov, literally released as war began in order to occupy key positions in the Red Army as it fought for its life. Few, if any, of the commanders convicted had committed identifiable crimes. The only consistent criterion appeared to be the elimination of all senior leaders who did not owe their careers to Stalin directly. I might therefore challenge his authority in the future. Of those imprisoned, 11,500 eventually gained reinstatement. Perhaps the most famous former prisoner was Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky, who ended the war as a marshal of the Soviet Union, commanding a front, which is equivalent to an army group. An entire generation of seasoned officers was wiped out, and new young officers without any experience and fearful of independent thought were thrown 2 or 3 ranks above their responsibilities. This was a sure recipe for disaster. Not only that, the entire deep operations doctrine was discarded, as it was closely associated with Tukhachevsky, and from then on, officers did not stray but a letter from the old-fashioned and obsolete doctrinal book from the Russian Civil War. They did not dare think by themselves or contradict political commissars or what they thought the Communist Party wanted to hear. There was one very notable exception, and this was Commander Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, one of Tukhachevsky's most brilliant disciples. He was lucky enough to be posted in the Far East, far from the real centers of power, and he survived the purges. Also, he was in charge of the undeclared war with Japan in the year of 1939, in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. After a previous indecisive clash in Lake Hassan in May of 1939, the Japanese occupied the village of Nomonhan, hoping to challenge the Soviets in an area where poor roads would restrict the size of forces that the attackers could bring to bear. After an initial encounter, undetected by the Japanese and despite the remote location of the village of Nomonhan, Zhukov amassed up to 57,000 men, 498 tanks, and 385 armored cars. Meanwhile, the Red Air Force reinforced the area with veterans of the Spanish Civil War, who achieved lopsided victories over the Japanese pilots. On Sunday, the 20th of August of 1939, Zhukov struck. After an initial aerial bombardment, a recently mobilized territorial division attacked, but became bogged down in front of the Japanese defenses. At the same time, however, Soviet mobile troops moved around both flanks and encircled most of the defending Japanese troops. The Japanese attempted to break out on the 27th of August, but they failed. On the 15th of September, the Japanese finally signed an agreement in Moscow to end the undeclared war. This very brief operation cost the Soviets 9,703 killed or missing or wounded soldiers, and 15,952 wounded or sick. The Japanese lost up to 61,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Khalkhin Gol was a Soviet victory and secured the Far East against Japanese aggression. But it was by no means at all an example of Soviet doctrine or even military preparedness. It was the exception. But when time came, Comrade Stalin would have a general to lean on, the efficient Zhukov. On the other hand, the dismal performance of the Red Army and the public international humiliation in its Pyrrhic victory over tiny Finland started the belated reforms, but only as late as 1940, which is just 1 year before the invasion. It was the worst time for the Red Army for a confrontation, and an arguable optimal moment for the Germans. Their armed forces were confident, with the highest morale after lightning-fast victories over many enemies, with low casualties and a sense of superiority that events seemed to justify. All but Great Britain had fallen, and she was alone and without any offensive capabilities for the foreseeable future. A huge theater of operations. Also, the great success of the German forces in Western, Northern, and Central Europe was characterized by a much smaller scale in the theater of operations. All of Central and Western Europe was smaller than the Soviet Union. Also, the infrastructure in Central and Western Europe was excellent when compared to the backward Soviet infrastructure that had a very small network of all-year and all-weather asphalt roads, and also a very small railroad network relative to the area and with a different gauge than in Europe. The Wehrmacht had the task to defeat the largest modern standing army and reserves in the whole world. Indeed, much larger than the Wehrmacht itself, along a front that was 1,800 kilometers or 1,120 miles wide and deep, from the Arctic to the Black Sea, and from the Polish border to just west of the Ural Mountains. The famous line running from the port of Arkhangelsk in the north to the city of Astrakhan in the delta of the Volga River on the Caspian Sea. In such a huge theater, the resources of the Wehrmacht were not sufficient to cover the whole front, not to mention to use the concentration of force, the famous Schwerpunkt, where the breakthrough in the front line was usually achieved, a key element for a blitzkrieg to be successful. The war theater in the Soviet Union favored mobility, but the infrastructure hampered it. The space was huge and demanded a larger force than the Wehrmacht could ever hope to put on the field. Reasons for invasion. Nevertheless, Hitler was dazed with success, very much like the rest of Germany, and the Soviet Union's purges and dismal performance in the war against tiny Finland only encouraged the case for invasion. The case for a successful invasion was based on a quick victory, like the ones they had just achieved in the West. Hitler and his generals thought that after destroying the Soviet armies on the border, there would be nothing to stop them east of the rivers Dwina and Dnieper. In his own words, as taken from the book The Campaign in Russia by German Generaloberst Gotthard Heinrizi, from the document A Talk with the Führer of the 5th of December of the year of 1940, Hitler said, quote, "The mass of the Red Army stationed in Western Russia is to be destroyed in bold operations involving deep penetrations by armored spearheads. And the withdrawal of elements capable of combat into the extensive Russian land spaces is to be prevented. By means of a rapid pursuit, a line is then to be reached from beyond which the Russian Air Force will no longer be capable of attacking the German home territories." Consequently, the Central Army Group aiming toward Moscow was to be made strong enough to be able to pivot northward with substantial forces. A decision whether or not to advance on Moscow or to an area east of Moscow could not be made until after the destruction of the Russian masses trapped in the anticipated northern and southern pockets. The cardinal point was the Russians must not be permitted to establish a rear defense position. Unquote. Hitler certainly had been honest about his intention of destroying the Red Army itself as the first priority. The capture of Moscow or any other city would be a subordinate objective to destroying the Red Army itself. Furthermore, and unbeknownst to the German dictator, the Soviet Union was very unprepared for war with Germany. The signature of the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact had prevented the Soviet Union from correctly assessing and preparing for the Nazi threat. The secret protocol in this pact had given the Soviets a free hand in the Baltics, Bessarabia, and northern Bukovina, as well as confirming their gains in the war against Finland. It had also given them the eastern part of Poland, with the result of the Soviet Union's eastern border moving hundreds of kilometers to the west, and away from the planned and partly finished Stalin defensive line of defense. Also, Stalin did not want to upset Hitler at all. Even more after seeing the dismal performance of his troops in Finland in 1940. The initial assessment of Nazi Germany as the greatest threat was, of course, correct, but the generals headed by Shaposhnikov and later Zhukov marked the land area north of the Pripyat marshes as the most likely target and route of invasion for the Wehrmacht. But Stalin had other ideas. He thought that the Germans would attack the Ukraine and the land south of the Pripyat marshes for its economic value, since most of the industry, the fertile land, the population, and the foodstuffs lay there. And of course, one does not contradict Comrade Stalin. The Great Purge had mostly just ended, but generals and any officials really were routinely inspected, bullied, interrogated, and some even still purged. Many people in the Soviet Union lived in a constant state of fear. It is curious to note that in war games held in January of 1941, Zhukov, then in charge of the invading forces, defeated General Pavlov's defending Red Army in the Western Front. After this, Zhukov was appointed Chief of Staff and was respected by Stalin. But when confronted with the dictator's insistence on the Ukraine being the target of a hypothetical invasion, then, even after the war games and all the evidence, Zhukov changed his initial judgment and agreed with Comrade Stalin in the end. In my personal opinion, he might have thought he would have been pushing his luck by sticking to his better judgment. So, in 1941, the Soviets were starting to re-educate the officer corps, redeploy defenses according to the Deep Operations Doctrine, and finally fixing their shortcomings, which were many. Some historians even argue that Stalin had a preemptive strike plan against Germany, but there is no sufficient evidence to support this claim. Of course, like some say, everything is possible on paper. But in reality, the troops and officers had no modern warfare education, such as combined arms or fire support and coordination. There were no sufficient resources for the whole effort. Tanks had no spare parts or fuel available to them. The infrastructure was appalling and very deficient. Supplies were lacking everywhere, even basic ones like weapons and ammunition. The defense lines remained concepts of paper, as the old Stalin defense line had been stripped of guns and other assets in order to defend the new positions hundreds of kilometers to the west. And there were almost no radios available. Battle operations like deep operations or a defense in depth were impossible, and we will see in later episodes what happened when commanders tried to counterattack or even move on the battlefield. Political commissars and fear of Stalin did not encourage personal initiative either. The organization of the Red Army did not help either. For example, the tanks were organized into huge mechanized corps of around 36,000 men and 1,000 tanks divided into 2 tank and 1 motorized divisions. The tanks were not deployed together, but rather scattered amongst the infantry and even in garrison duties up to 100 kilometers apart from each other. The infantry divisions were theoretically organized in a similar manner to the German army. But all divisions were at around 60 to 70% of their nominal strength on paper at the time Barbarossa began. Yes, the Soviet Union had a huge number of tanks and planes. It was actually the largest force in the world at the time in these two aspects. But most models were obsolete and in need of urgent repair with no spare parts available. Also, the Red Army was under Stalin's policy of defending every single square kilometer or inch of territory. No retreat under any circumstances, which proved to be a disastrous policy in almost every single case, save a few. After the fact, now with the huge amount of information and accounts we have, it is only fair to say that in general terms, the performance of the Soviet soldier was exemplary and unrelenting, heroic and extremely valiant in the majority of cases, even in defeat and surrender. We will see this later on, case by case. So, was Germany superior to the Soviet Union? Oh, of course not. Let us divide the whole picture into 6 smaller parts. Although, of course, there are more reasons, but personally I have chosen these either because they are very important and relevant, or because they are indeed important but catch the public's imagination incorrectly, such as the Panzers. First, the Panzers. The Soviet Union had the best tanks and plenty more of them, period. At the time, most German Panzer divisions were equipped with a mixture of the Panzer Mark I and Mark II light tanks, the Panzer Mark III and Mark IV medium tanks, the Panzer Befehl or command tanks, plus the Panzer 38T Czech-built medium tanks with the 37mm main guns, as substitutes for the Panzer III models in many divisions. However, the light and command tanks, which constituted as much as 1/3 of the division's combat strength, were seriously undergunned with machine guns and 20mm main guns. And therefore unable to contend with the new model Red Army tanks, such as the famous T-34 and KV tanks. On the other hand, although the dependable second-generation Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks were more than a match for the older Soviet tanks, such as the T-26 light and T-28 medium and T-35 heavy models, even they experienced difficulty destroying the T-34 and KV-1 and KV-2 tanks. No German weapon mounted on any German tank on the field could penetrate the thick frontal armor of the T-34 medium tanks and KV-1 and KV-2 heavy tanks that were coming off the assembly lines in Russia. The average German Panzer division fielded only about 125 tanks, and as we see, they were mostly obsolete. They also were mostly lacking in motorized transport for the supporting infantry. And just trying to repair tanks or any other vehicle was a real nightmare for the variety of Czech tanks, some French light tanks, even heavy tanks, and many French trucks. And also because most German tanks had too much engineering. They were very complicated machines with a very large number of moving parts that were very hard to substitute and repair. The Soviet tank was a simple, rugged, and much less expensive and sophisticated machine, much easier to produce in large quantities and easier and faster to repair. A former civilian quickly turned into a tankist with a quick course could repair a Russian tank. On the other hand, you needed a specialist with experience in the German Panzer arm. Germany was not geared for war, and even less for a long war of attrition. The economy was kept as normal, producing civilian goods as in peacetime. Not even the women were drafted in the workforce, they remained at home. On the contrary, the Soviet Union was on a full economic and social mobilization from day one. And of course, The population in the Soviet Union dwarfed that of Germany, even with the imported voluntary and forced enslaved workers. Hitler had always counted on a quick victory, like the ones he had in the north and the west of Europe. He was already planning the production for the Air Force and Navy for future expansion in the Middle East and elsewhere. The Air Force. The German Luftwaffe indeed had excellent planes, like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter. But it also relied heavily on the Stuka dive bomber, a plane that was clearly obsolete in the Battle of Britain a year before, and that could only be effective with complete air superiority. Germany actually had about 200 less bombers on the eve of Barbarossa than a year before, and 2,770 planes in total for Barbarossa. And that could only be effective by concentrating its force as a tactical force. But it could never hope to attack along the whole front. Its numbers were just too few. Next, and very simple, there were no sufficient German or even Axis forces for the whole theater of operations. The defense-in-depth doctrine was impossible to implement, and any enemy breakthrough or just simple attrition would mean disaster and defeat and spell utter doom. Next, and very important, the whole German effort depended on good logistics and infrastructure, such as the one found in Western and Central Europe. The railroad gauge was wider in the Soviet Union. Paved all-weather roads were very few and far between. So all these lines of communication were obvious military targets, and perfect for partisans. That could mean turning victory to defeat, or stopping an offensive in its tracks, or even seeing the troops fall apart and disappear to attrition. And yes, of course, I will mention the weather. Everybody has heard about the appalling winter in Russia, but not everybody knows about the Rasputitsa, or literally the Sea of Mud, which is a type of weather that happens twice a year, during the spring and the fall, when movement is almost impossible. The German army did not provide its soldiers with winter clothing, nor did its tanks and vehicles have wider tracks to move through mud and snow, or engines that worked in freezing temperatures. Generals winter mud and the appalling infrastructure truly affected both sides, but generally worked in favor of the Soviets. What Germany finally saw in the Soviet Union was an incompetent military leadership that could extract a humiliating victory over the Finns only after committing huge forces and resources. Also, a bloodthirsty and brutish dictator and political leadership that terrorized its own leaders and people. Years of starvation, poor planning, and economic and political incompetence left no doubt in the mind of another British dictator that, quote, "All you have to do is kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will crumble to the ground," unquote. As for the future of the conquered land and its people, it was to be even worse than under Stalin. In order to summarize Hitler's criminal idea for the East, it was going to be a land destined to be colonized by the Aryan race. Its current population was to be enslaved or exterminated by summary execution or hunger. The future for the people of the Soviet Union was bleak, coming from barely surviving under the boot of a brutal dictator to sheer extermination or slavery under another. But going back to June the 22nd, the words of Yuri Levitin struck fear, but also hope in the common Soviet citizen's mind. A resolve to join and stand together against what was the purest form of evil they had faced until then. And in the meantime, Stalin now had a real enemy to fight. And maybe, just maybe, he would end his bloodthirsty purges and persecutions. For, as Yuri Levitin said, a great patriotic war of the Soviet people against fascist aggressors has begun. Ours is the righteous cause. The enemy shall be defeated. Victory will be ours.